Hi, this is Jim Petoskey. I teach grades 6 through 8 at the American International School in Cape Town, South Africa. The grades I will be concentrating on are 6 Earth Science and 7 Life Science. The aim of my study is to improve instruction for English language learners, basically in terms of increasing the number of modes of instruction I have for each learner target. Effectively, that has meant decreasing the number of minutes I spend on each task. So for a given task, let's move on to the next slide. For example, let's say note-taking strategies. Instead of spending 40 minutes on a note-taking strategy, I'm spending about 20 minutes on a specific portion of notes. And then I will cover that same information with something like reading or a video or possibly labs and activities. Now, this has altered my instruction somewhat, but not entirely. Basically, I'm covering the same thing from different angles, or what I would call different modes. The way this is going to improve classroom equity is by helping my ELLs to understand more of the scientific information. Traditionally, ELLs have struggled to understand scientific information, mainly due to vocabulary, in addition to some other language factors. One of the things in any course that you may see ELLs do is what Atwater pointed out is a common coping and passive resistant mechanism, such as silence, accommodation, ingratiation, invasiveness, or manipulation. Now, most often I see silence and accommodation. ELLs just don't want to be bothered. And if that's the case, then most teachers leave them alone. And what I've tried to do is, well, 1, not leave them alone, and 2, help them to be as comfortable as possible. One of the ways I've found to help ELLs be comfortable, funny enough, this was occurring before I started this project, so it's not something I've changed so much in my instruction, but helping ELLs in small groups to reduce anxiety. I think teaching through inquiry, we often use small groups to decrease anxiety and help students share information. So this is actually one facet of my instruction that's great for ELLs already. The focus of the project is on increasing the modes of instruction, and that's one thing that I was altering in my instruction. Okay. Guiding questions. Basically, can I increase the achievement of ELLs in my classroom by providing multiple sources of information? Also, decreasing the complexity of my language, improving my speech pattern slightly, or to the best of my ability to be understandable, and also including those small group work. Now, I have been concentrating on decreasing the complexity of my language before this, but it's been especially important during the intervention period. Also, is anxiety a factor in lower ELL performance? We're going to explore that later. Interesting findings in this study. Okay, ELLs in the science class. What did the intervention look like? Well, it was about 3 to 4 weeks long. It covered 1 unit. Before the intervention, I was not increasing my number of modes of instruction. So I waited to do the intervention period right up until the unit started. So I had a full unit doing a different intervention during a different strategy, increase the number of modes of instruction. After that unit, we did a summative assessment. So I used the summative assessment from before the intervention started and after. In addition to that, I used a student survey, and we'll get to that in the results. Now, ELLs in science class, basically I assessed their anxiety by asking them a few questions on the student survey. We'll examine one of those questions later. Basically, how comfortable are you in science class is the question, and they rated themselves on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 being low, not comfortable, 5 being great and very comfortable. Essentially, researched and recorded the summative assessments. The average modes of instruction that I used before and after the survey, which basically translates to going back and looking at my notes from before, my lesson plans, and then taking field notes after on how many modes of instruction I was using. The evaluation section quantified the number of, or basically an ELL status, as how many years they'd been in an English-speaking classroom. This meant that students who were in an English-speaking classroom for more years would have a lower L status, and I could actually quantify that. This was very helpful instead of having L's grouped in either L's or non-L's. With such a simple rating system, I can't actually assess quite the quantity of an L that someone is. And at an international school, we have students coming from many backgrounds. There are many forms of an English language learner here in Cape Town. Next, I calculated the average number of modes of instruction, I mentioned earlier, and I correlated those to student anxiety, so their comfort level, and understanding what they were supposed to learn, the learner outcome, in addition to their summative assessment score. Now, here's my numbers from before and after the intervention. You can see that I was using much fewer modes of instruction before than I did after. You can see 2.5 to 4.5 is quite a change. This was basically the number that came from my notes. Down here, we can see the different modes of instruction that I used before the intervention and during. There was a few types of instruction that I incorporated during the intervention, which was more notes on the whiteboard, students showing answers under the document camera, so having students actually get to the board and talk to other students, showing their answers and having a discussion. Lastly, reading out loud I found to be more effective, and I actually was taking another course at the time on close reading and found that hearing the words can also help ELLs. So that's another form of information delivery. Lastly, using Edmodo as a source to record our information, and this is a class web page I can briefly show you here. Looks very similar to a Facebook feed, allows us to post and retrieve information and students to comment. Let's dissect some of the data. In the results section, we noticed that anxiety actually increased for ELLs relative to their peers after the study. This seems to be due to 7th grade genetics unit. And in that unit, there was a complex vocabulary, which actually increased the anxiety of ELLs. Now, later on, we'll see that this may not actually correlate to a lower performance on assessments. When you are looking at these graphs, you can see that the slope here is how I'm reading that the anxiety increased. A more positive slope indicates higher anxiety or lower comfort level for ELLs relative to their peers. So the slope actually increased, which is not what we'd hope. Next slide. This is comparing the actual raw scores, or the percentage scores for the summative assessments, to the comparative scores from ELLs. This is showing that the raw scores aren't actually an indication of how closely ELLs score to their peers. And that in 6th grade, we see ELLs score very close to their peers. This is a very high scoring ELL group, quite outstanding group of individuals, and probably a result of them taking English as a second language in their previous school, which is common in international schools that don't speak English. So not too much to learn from the 6th graders with them scoring so highly previous to the intervention period. Next, we see the 7th grade scores. This is something to look at. This is very interesting. We notice that the slope has decreased by a factor of 50%. This means the 7th graders scored their ELLs. The ELLs scored worse relative to their peers before than they did after. And remember that from 2 slides previous, we noticed that the anxiety level actually increased for ELLs. So as overall anxiety levels increased, we actually saw an increase in ELLs performance relative to their peers, which means that something was working, especially for the 7th graders. With the 6th grade data, 1 slide previous, we noticed that it's tough to tell because the 6th grade ELLs were already performing well compared to their peers before the study. Here we see an improvement of the 7th grade ELLs after the study. Exciting. Now, what does this mean? ELLs anxiety isn't necessarily tied to their performance. That's what we thought going in. I thought that ELLs anxiety would would be a large factor in their performance. And maybe it is, but we can see that even with increasing anxiety, ELLs can still perform. Next, ELLs do perform better with increased modes of instruction. And it doesn't necessarily, the 6th grade data doesn't necessarily indicate that, but they were already doing well previously. In the 7th grade, we do see a large improvement. 50% is a big number. Next, I was able to answer my research questions well, but I could have improved in 2 main areas. One was having a better assessment of students' anxiety, more data point, more questions, and a better quantitative system. In addition to focusing instruction more on vocabulary. During the unit and after the unit, I received a lot of feedback from students indicating they could have used more help on the vocabulary. I think that is attributed to the genetics section as well. Lastly, the main strengths of the study. It was long comparatively, but obviously could have been longer. Gleaned open-ended data from student survey that'll improve my instruction later on. I just mentioned that vocabulary was something that was reported as being difficult for students, which we can work on. And it motivated me to pursue additional research articles. The main limitations were the strong assessment of student anxiety and basically lack of vocabulary, something I've been saying over the last 3 slides. Needed to have more explicit instruction on vocabulary. Doing this again, you can see I would increase explicit instruction. I would increase vocabulary use. Something like Quizlet would be a really good program to use, and I would have improved my survey to begin with. Been saying this for the past few slides. I'll say it one last time. Going forward, there's a lot of good things that I did. Increasing the modes of instruction, small group work, improving my language, and lastly, we just need to have a more explicit form of instructing on vocabulary. And I think I have an idea of how that would be done through iPad app Quizlet. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you gleaned some important information from this. That ELLs anxiety isn't necessarily linked to their performance. However, having them in a decent range of anxiety, I'm sure, is important. I think most students rated themselves in the 3 to 4 range in my class, which is comfortable to slightly more than comfortable. And I think staying in that range would be important for instruction. Lastly, that increasing the modes of instruction does help ELLs and most likely helps all students. Even though we can't say that that is true over the raw score, that the average is increased, I think that's a unit-to-unit problem rather than an overall issue. And thanks for watching. Again, I hope this helped.